So, yeah, we're very lucky to have Harry McLaren come and join us today. So Harry's from Adarma, which is a kind of managed security service provider based in Edinburgh, which has got a history I'm sure Harry will tell you about. And Harry is, I think your title is product lead. Is that right now? For
That is correct.
Detection and
Response.
Is that right? Yeah. So again, Harry can fill you in about that, but I think he's responsible for kind of, Adarma wide product management and development and all sorts now. So he'll be able to tell you about that. But he's also kind of a leading light in the kind of Splunk area in the UK. And Adarma itself is well, he'll probably tell you a little bit about the history of the company, but they definitely have had a strong relationship with us for more than a decade now, and based in Edinburgh, and have grown rapidly and have lots of blue chip financial companies. I'd say probably would be our main kind of focus, with lots of kind of SOC operation management and SOC operation center work, which I think Harry's going to tell you about. So that's probably enough introduction, unless there's anything else. You probably cover most of it. So
No, that's great, Rich.
Harry.
Thank you. I'll get my screen sharing and make sure that's working. Is that coming through?
That's it. Perfect.
Great. And can still see it?
Yep. Spot
Perfect.
on. So if anyone's got any questions, you can post them in the chat, or Harry's going to have something, and we'll have a Q&A near the end.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. So thank you to Bill, thank you to Rich for the invite. It's always nice to come back to Napier, even if it is in the virtual sense. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about modern security operations, and I'm going to focus on the technology and especially one of the frameworks that we use in the private sector. But first and foremost, I'll introduce myself and explain a little bit about my journey. My name's Harry McLaren. My current role is I'm the product lead at Adarma for detection and response. As Rich alluded to, this essentially means that I'm responsible for owning all of our products, which are in the detection and response arena. That includes a lot of our SOC, security operations type services, most of our big data type services, and a whole bunch of other things that I wish I knew more about, but don't have the time to explore, like endpoint detection and response capabilities and other things. My background is that I started with Adarma, and I'll share a little bit more about this in a bit, but in 2013, they hired me actually my fourth year, so before I actually finished my degree, which I then did finish, but they hired me as a senior security analyst, and then I went on to become a security engineer, focusing on Splunk and deploying it all around the UK and once in Qatar. And then I moved on to consultancy. So I'll explain a little bit about engineer versus consultant in a bit. In total, I've got about 14 years experience in IT/cybersecurity. It's about half and half, with starting first of all in computer kind of IT support. I'm a proud alumnus of Napier. I studied digital forensics and computer security, originally joining in my second year in 2010. And then, I also co-founded Cyber Connect. If you're not a member, it's a completely free community-based organization focused obviously around Scotland. Heavy focus on Edinburgh, simply because that's where the founders live, myself and Stu Hurst. So if you don't know about Cyber Connect, do check us out. We run a lot of events, and we've got a Slack, and just try and support people working within cybersecurity and information security as best we can. I use Twitter a lot, mostly to consume, occasionally to post, although more recently it's been cat pictures since I just got a cat. And because I believe in transparency, I'm also dyslexic. It's not something I'm going to focus on in this presentation, but if it's something you're interested in learning more about, or indeed you yourself and you're diverse, more than happy to talk with you about it, or take some questions offline and cover that in the Q&A if helpful. On the Splunk note, one thing I guess of interest is I am a member, excuse me, of a Splunk Trust. That's their MVP program, of which is about, I think, 72 members, and we get kind of elected, so to speak, from the Splunk community every year. So I'm quite proud to do that. One of the byproducts of that, which is I have mixed feelings about, is we do get a fez, hence why the logo is a fez. So I have a Splunk Trust fez, which is up on my wall, which is, you will find some people at Splunk events wearing them. It's not usually me. Anyway, moving on to a bit about my employer. So Adarma has been around now for about 10 years. They started under the name Vactor. Vactor was acquired by a group IT company called ECS. And then we recently, over the last 18 months, went through what's called a management buyout, where essentially a private equity firm took special interest in us and thought that we could do really great things if we were given a bit more money and some support. And we've been doing just that. So when I joined, I was employee number 24 within Adarma, so very much startup size. And I think we've now just hit 300 people. So, you know, huge growth, and our specialities are specifically around threat management. We are a defense company, so, you know, we don't do pen testing or red teaming. We are squarely in the blue team, occasionally dip our toe into the purple team arena. And we do so for most of the UK's largest financial companies. So companies like Lloyds Bank, Royal Bank of Scotland, HSBC, Barclays, etc. And then we also play really heavily in the retail space. So Tesco, Sainsbury's, and Burberry, if you can imagine that, are customers of ours. And we're really proud to have kind of, you know, branched out into other areas. NHS Scotland being kind of one of the latest new areas that we're working with and, you know, focusing on. So what I'm going to share with you over the next hour or so is I'm going to introduce myself, which I've just done, and I'm going to talk for about probably the next 5 minutes a little bit about my journey into cybersecurity and into my profession. I'm going to share what I perceive to be some of the most common SOC technology areas, and then kind of also cover where Splunk fits into that model. And then I'm going to focus most of my time on what's called detection engineering and the MITRE attack framework. And then I'm going to finish off by just covering some common roles and competency areas within the kind of blue cybersecurity domain, so the defense domain. If you want to write out any questions for me, which we'll get to at the end, feel free to use Slido and with the code MeetMe. Or obviously welcome to use the Zoom chat feature as well. Slido just might make it a bit more organized when it comes to working out whose question to answer when, and you can upvote questions as well. So I'll answer the ones with the most votes first, pending time. So where did I start? So I've been what I guess you would traditionally call a nerd since the early noughties. So 11, 12, when I started taking apart computers, I fortunately only caused one small fire and managed to put it out myself in my loft bedroom as I was trying to pull apart and build a second PC for my friend to be able to play Counter-Strike 1.1 with me on a internal LAN I've created. I, like I'm sure many of you, have spent many hours fixing family and friends' computers, whether that be Windows, Linux, or Mac OS based, and I continue to have that privilege. I started to tinker in website design probably around 12, 13 using Microsoft Front Page originally. Some incredible software when you think about what it was trying to do at the time, but it led to me really publishing some very average websites, which I continue to dabble in, but mostly using WordPress for simplicity. My first official job in IT, i.e. when I was actually employed and got paid, was when I was 18. So I was an IT technician in my local computer repair shop. You can see a picture of it there in the top right. We primarily built and sold computers and repaired them, laptop screens, all that kind of thing. It's where I started getting interested in security. We did a lot of malware cleanups, and I became fascinated by looking at the way the malware infected machines, reinfected them, how we would accidentally flood our internal LAN at the shop by connecting a computer with a worm on it and wonder why machines that we'd just finished were getting reinfected. I started playing with tools from sysinternals and Nearsoft, which enabled me to look at things like all the process injections that were occurring, all files that were being touched by various malware, and using various command line tools to look at all the different network connections that the malware was doing. So wouldn't say I became a reverse engineer by any stretch of the word, but I started to really kind of focus in on the security components and how you could protect yourselves from them. So I was also at college. I studied to become an IT practitioner for 2 years. And after kind of realizing that while being an IT technician was really interesting and I got a lot out of it, I was really interested in kind of specializing a little bit more. And so I got enough UCAS points to then get into university. So as I said, so 2006, when I first got my first job and also got my kind of first formal education in IT. By 2010, that's when I moved to Edinburgh and started studying at Napier. I did a placement year in 2000 and would have been 11 to 12 at BlackRock in IT support, which was really useful for my career to get early exposure to a large enterprise and see how they worked. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I got hired by Adarma as a senior security analyst in 2013. As a side note, the reason I got hired as a senior analyst as opposed to a standard security analyst was because of my experience as an IT technician. They knew that I had customer management experience, that I was a pretty decent verbal communicator, and because Adarma had just won its first large SOC contract, they needed people that could, provide some form of senior cover, even if I really didn't have any experience in that, specific domain. It gave me a leg up in my career, which I'm very grateful for. So between 2013, 2018, I moved into a security engineer role that was primarily focused around using Splunk for detection, the kind of thing that I know Bill and Mitch have been kind of showing you. Splunk is one of the best in class big data tools and best in class SIEMs for security. And therefore, Adarma started to become a really influential partner in the UK region. And we're their largest professional services organization. So I was one of the first 3 engineers we trained in Splunk. We now have over 50 and over 120 people with kind of Splunk technical certification. In that period, I think I went through every Splunk certification you could. I think I ended up with 12, some which are still current, most which are not. Now I've been doing other things. But it meant that I got the opportunity to, work with some of the UK's largest banks in architecting their deployments, making sure they were resilient, it could scale into the terabytes per day and beyond, which, I found really interesting and realized that I really, enjoyed the kind of big picture stuff. That led on to my security consultancy role, where I was less about hands on the keyboard, actually writing code or configuration or SPL, and more focused on solution architecture and, talking about transformation, especially within security operations. As those skills solidified and I started to kind of hold my own vision of how I think things should go, at the end of 2019, we identified that we really needed some form of product management within the organization. And this is, both technical product management, i.e. there are 2 people who do this role within the organization, myself and a person called Alistair Thompson. But it's also the strategic and vision side. So we are the custodians of Adarma's vision for products and services. Therefore, we have to remain subject matter experts in our field to make sure that we're competent in what we recommend Adarma invests in. So this may well be something that you're very familiar with, but I thought I would cover that from my perspective. What is a cybersecurity professional? What is it that I got into? What is my career? And fundamentally, I see it as being a defender and being a protector. And I think those 2 words are really important. And I think even if you get into pen testing or red teaming, your overarching objective is doing that and simulating adversarial activity to defend others and to protect other people, whether they be large corporate organizations, your parents, your grandparents. You know, if you're interested in this stuff, then hopefully you're doing it because you're interested in, you know, bettering others and yourself to be more defended. It's really interesting that our industry outside of the military is one of the only industries, probably excluding physical security, where we are constantly fighting active adversaries. You know, there are many roles that are, of course, always battling against, you know, exterior forces, whether they be natural or societal, but we are actively being attacked, you know, both as individuals, as organizations, sometimes as nation states. And, you know, therefore to work in this industry means to recognize that you are going to be entering a field where, you know, fundamentally there are forces out there, whether they be organized criminals or, you know, bad nation state actors, that they want to take you down. You know, they want to gather intel on you to, you know, potentially bribe you. You know, all these things are things that you may encounter in your career. And I think it's really important to be cognizant of that. I also find that part quite exciting, that you're playing cat and mouse. You're always engaged in, you know, a form of arms race to make sure that you can detect, respond and recover from attacks, you know, as fast as possible. And I think this comic that I saw on Instagram pop up in my feed a few months ago just really summarized it for me, in that, you know, we have to be in a constant state of learning and alert, so that we can adequately make sure that we're alerting users, you know, colleagues, peers, etc., of new attacks that are coming out, new vulnerabilities that are being discovered, to then try and work out, well, how do we respond to these things? How do we make sure we're protecting people in the best possible way? And so now I'm going to move into a bit more about security operations. So SOC for me, so SOC standing for Security Operations Center. Really, this is covering broad security operations in general. Doesn't have to have the center part on the end, or fusion, or there's many other buzzwords, but these are some of the key services that I see SOCs commonly offering, and then the ones that we commonly offer within our SOC. So starting from kind of left to right, there's basic monitoring. So this is just, you know, monitoring other security tooling like firewall alerts, or, you know, network intrusion detection or protection devices, AV, that kind of thing. And it's making sure that, you know, when those come out, that you can search through the logs. And obviously, you know, you've been doing some labs around Splunk. You're familiar with what that might look like. Detection for me is when this starts to mature, when you start to write rules, and in Splunk that would be a saved search that then triggers an alert into something else. And you might start to pull together disparate log sources. So yes, you might look at some Apache web logs, but you might correlate that against your identity engine, so Active Directory or Okta or something else, to try and correlate activity. Analysis is then trying to bring in additional context. So not just did, you know, for example, a user account fail 3 times to log into a particular service, but that person is also marked as on holiday. So now with that context, what could be a user just, you know, mistakenly entering their password suddenly looks more malicious because you've added contextual information. Response is fundamentally the target of every security operations function. Detection without response is not very helpful because you have no capability to either interrupt or interrupt or recover from an attack. So response can include things like incident management, you know, trying to gather all the detail in one place. It can include forensic investigations, so taking devices and actually forensically analyzing them for evidence. But fundamentally, response is about disrupting the attack chain. So the sequence of events that an attacker goes through to try and, you know, achieve their objectives, whatever they may be. You want to disrupt them as early as possible. Hunting is about being proactive. So if monitoring and detection is all about predicting to a point how an attacker might, you know, be seen within your network. So for example, you know, if I see 3 failed logins within a 5-minute window, that is a prediction or a known. You're saying, I think I know what this attack would look like in the logs. Hunting is about finding unknowns. So you don't know if you're being attacked, and you're not sure how you would spot it. And you do that through essentially applying the scientific method of forming a hypothesis, testing it, and then feeding that back into a continuous improvement cycle so that, you know, in the future, you're proactively looking for that kind of activity. And finally, and this is about automation and orchestration. So this is about ensuring that all the tasks that computers can do automatically, that they are enabled to do so. So the example I gave about pulling in contextual information about a user that's on holiday, why should that be a manual step where you have to log into an Active Directory server, pull down that information, copy and paste it, screenshot it, etc.? Why isn't the tooling that you're paying often a lot of money for doing that for you? Why doesn't the alert come in from Splunk also highlighting in bold, by the way, this user is also on holiday? And they're the kind of things that I would say, you know, maturing security operations services are trying to achieve. So when I say service, what do I mean? Well, a service for me is made up of 4 key components, and we're going to be focusing on technology, but it's really important to realize that it's made up of people, process, technology, and then governance that's wrapped around the whole thing. Okay, so PPTs, just as they apply to an attacker, they also apply to the defenders, to services. You cannot run a service without people. People need guidance and processes and documentation to understand what they're trying to do and do so in a repeatable way. We use technology to make those processes go faster, be more effective, and have guardrails around them. You could look manually through all of your Apache logs, line by line. We use technology like Splunk to make that process go faster. Governance is about governing people, process, and technology. Governance ensures that when you bring a new person into the organization, they're being trained in the same way as the people that already work there. Governance makes sure that the technology is kept up to date and makes sure that people are doing things in the right way when they're developing on Splunk. Governance ensures that your processes are still fit for purpose and they're being reviewed on a regular basis. All of these things are absolutely critical to maintaining high quality services, which are obviously very important if your job is defending against attackers. So looking at detection, what are some of the key technology components, or let's say the features you require from your technology? So first and foremost, you need to generate logs. Now, this is often an overlooked step, but it is as critical as any other. You have to have something sitting on an endpoint, on a device, monitoring a network that is generating some form of log data. Now, in the example that Bill's shown you earlier, I suspect that was either an IIS web server or an Apache web server, but there has to be a function within that software that says, when activity is detected, I will write to a log file. If you don't have that first step, then you can't do anything else with it. Other examples of log generation might be the Windows event log, Sysmon. In Linux, it might be your audit log or your messages log. All of these logs have to be generated by something, and you also need to put protections around them so that attackers can't disable that log generation. Otherwise, you don't see any of that activity. Shipping, or log shipping. This is making sure that those logs that are often generated on individual servers and endpoints can actually get to you to be analyzed. You don't want to go and manually SSH or RDP into a server to copy a bunch of log files or binary files for analysis. You want them to be shipped to you. The Splunk Universal Forwarder is a great example of this. Others would be FluentD, Beats, etc. These are all log shippers, and their primary function is usually getting flat text files, reading them or tailing them, and sending that data somewhere else. Processing, or data parsing. This is taking these very different disparate formats of data and processing them into a standard way, extracting their fields, making sure their line breaks are done properly, the timestamps are accurate, time zones, etc. Then have storage. Where is all this data going to go? What kind of storage? Is it object storage? Is it flat file storage? Is it going into an index or a non-index? Is it going into a database? All this data needs to go somewhere, and it usually needs to be kept for a very specific length of time. In financial services, that's almost always at least 13 months worth of storage. If that's a terabyte of data a day, that's a lot of hard drives. Search, often the most exciting and the part that you interact with the data first. Search is about obviously the ability to query the data and do so at scale. That is Splunk's bread and butter, and its primary function is the ability to query data and then display it back to you in a way that's useful. Alerting is then turning those searches into things that happen on a regular basis so that you don't have to do it in an ad hoc or manual manner. These are often referred to as security rules or detective controls. These alerts, sometimes numbering in the thousands, will sit there and just repeatedly scan through the most recent logs to try to detect threat activity. Triage, this is when humans generally are first interacting with the alert. This is often referred to as case management. And this is pretty much where a human, or in some cases, an automation platform, starts to try and work out, well, is one alert more important than another? Some of our security operations centers get 7,000 alerts per day. How do you, as a human, decide which one is more important than another? And that comes down to priority. You need to understand the priority. Going back to the example I used earlier, a brute force attack alert, because there has been 3 failed logins, you might get 100 of them a day because people are always forgetting their passwords. But out of those 100 alerts, 2 of them had the contextual information that said the person is also out of office. Those 2, for me, would be much higher priority than all the rest, and I'm going to action those before anything else. There's a whole lot more that would go here in the response side, but we're going to focus on detection for now. Now, I mentioned Splunk, and you're obviously all familiar with it. So this is where Splunk for us fits in to that same image. Splunk does pretty much everything for us other than log generation. It does log shipping, processing, storage. It gives us a search capability, alerting, and depending on if you've got Splunk Enterprise Security or not, it can also do a form of case management. Now, for us in Adarma, we then use Splunk Phantom, which is their SOAR platform, which stands for Security, Orchestration, Automation, and Response. We use that for the response side as well. But just to give you an idea of where Splunk Enterprise fits in with that technology flow, it fits in almost everywhere, which is why we use it. So now let's look at detection engineering. So, those rules, those alerts, how do you actually come up with them? So in a bit of a simplified model, somebody somewhere, often a dedicated team, will model a threat. This could also be external, where you've actually just subscribed and said, well, I'm interested in knowing about the most modern threats to financial services. And they'll say, oh, have you heard of this one? And you go, oh, okay, I hadn't heard of that. So this comes up with a requirement. Now, when I use the word countermeasure, you can kind of replace that with rule for now. We tend to refer to them as countermeasures, but anyway. So there is a requirement for a new countermeasure. So this is then worked through, and you work out what exactly you need to implement. So between new countermeasure and detection configuration change, that is when you're prototyping a new control. You're honing your SPL. You're making sure that you're not getting loads of false positives. But then that change has to happen within a system. Now, systems that are in production or live being used, you can't just change them at will. So you first of all prototype it, you then deploy it in a warranty state. Now, a warranty state means that usually it will sit there in production, but it will not be alerting. So you will monitor it perhaps over a week, sometimes 2, to actually see, is it functioning as intended? Throughout that warranty process, you'll often do some monitoring of it, and you'll tune it. Tuning meaning you might refine baselines or signatures or behavioral indicators that you've baked in to your rule. This will then often get deployed in live mode. Live now means we are alerting to the SOC, and that tends to be where your detection engineering flow stops. The SOC, of course, the security operations analysts, are then going to triage and investigate and do all their part, but that's not part of the detection engineering process. Now, detection engineering has a number of big challenges. These are shown here. Now, human error is something that we're all prone to. Whether it's just simply, misspelling a variable or an index in Splunk, which I do all the time, whether it's failing to test and test effectively. And another threat is duplicate effort. So these three areas are what I identified at the beginning of, well, middle of last year, when we started to look at ways to improve what we do. And when we actually went out and we did some monitoring of things that were working well and not working so well in our remote security operations center, these were the key areas that we saw as threats to them doing a good job. So we came up with two key objectives. And those objectives were we want faster adaptation, basically meaning that we become more effective, so that we can move through that detection engineering lifecycle faster and with much more accuracy. And then the second was we want to be able to scale our security operation teams in a much more efficient way. So if you have a person doing 10 units of work per day and it takes them their 12-hour shift, yes, you could hire another person and double that throughput. But if you make them more efficient, then you actually can give them 15 units of work, but they can achieve it within the same time period. Now, it's not good enough just to tell them to work harder, nor is it particularly fair. So what you have to look at is the way you're working. And this is where I'm going to introduce you to MITRE ATT&CK. MITRE ATT&CK and ATT&CK is an acronym for Adversarial Tactics, Techniques, and Common Knowledge, is a body of knowledge fitted with a framework which gives you a really good blueprint for visualizing how attacks function. So what it starts with is tactics. So if you look in the middle of that diagram, it's essentially the kill chain. What are the common steps adversaries go through to try and, complete their objectives when they're attacking you? Now, those objectives could be a denial of service. They could be data theft, could be all kinds of things. So once you've got that, you then say, well, what are some of the common techniques that attackers use within each of those steps? I'm going to show you what that looks like in a minute. Now, the reason ATT&CK is so awesome, one, it's open and you can contribute to it. And there are a lot in there. I think there's over 230 techniques there, but they also give you indicators on these are some of the detection methods you can use to detect this technique. And these are some of the data sources you would need to onboard into your big data tool, i.e. Splunk, to be able to detect them. Within the framework, they also link this to adversary intelligence. So they'll tell you some threat actors that actually leverage those specific techniques and what tools they use to do so. And finally, there'll be mitigation advice. So not just how to detect it, but also how to harden your environment and protect yourself against those types of attacks. For example, network sniffing as a technique, things that you could use to detect that would be prior activities indicating compromise, changes in network data flow, and ARP spoofing. Logs that you need to bring in could be network device logs, so from things like your routers, switches, firewalls, host network interfaces from your endpoints, net flow data, and process monitoring. Now, the phases of attack, i.e. mapped to the tactics, the kill chain, adversaries often use network sniffing during credential access and discovery. Are there any known threat actors that currently use it? Yes, ATT&CK, also known as Fancy Bear, which if I remember correctly, is a Russian threat actor. What are some of the mitigations or the things you can do to protect yourself? Well, the advice from ATT&CK is encrypt your sensitive information, i.e. so it can't be sniffed, and use multi-factor authentication. So in one go, you've got a huge quantity of context, information, and useful next steps that you can do to make sure that your organization or customer is protected. Now, what this looks like, if you go onto their website, is this. And I wouldn't try and get eye strain by trying to read it. The point is, it's massive. And under many of these, which are the ones with the small gray tab on the right-hand side, have a bunch of sub-techniques as well. So it's a huge repository of knowledge, which if we zoom in on one, looks a little bit like this. So tactics across the top, an attacker, initial access to the system via the technique, spear phishing. They then conduct discovery using remote system discovery as their technique. And then they collect what they've found using data from network shared drives. So that straight away tells you, well, things I need to protect and detect. I need to protect and detect spear phishing. I need to protect against and detect remote system discovery. And I need to, again, protect and detect data being collected from shared network drives. So again, all of that is within the attack framework, and it's an absolutely incredible tool that enables us, if we go back to our objectives for improvement, it makes us far more effective because we're now not just using our own brains and our own research, we're gathering it from a huge community. It makes us more efficient because we don't have to go and document all of this ourselves and hypothesize a bunch of attack vectors that we didn't know about because someone's doing it. Now, it doesn't mean you shouldn't also do more hunting and research of your own, but it means that you're starting from a really strong foundation. So, for example, this is the web page for spear phishing. And you can see there's a bunch of information here. There's nice, rich, free-form text that explains what it is. That's the kind of information that might be useful to for training or to management. On the right-hand side, you've got a bunch of metadata telling you its ID, what it's a sub-technique of, what platforms it applies to, data sources, etc., who's contributed to it. So there's tons of really rich information. And as I mentioned, it goes down into mitigations and detection as well. So mitigations for spear phishing, well, you could restrict web-based content. And if you click on that hyperlink, it will go into more detail about what that means. And then the other is user training. As we all know, spear phishing is fundamentally a form of social engineering where you're trying to trick somebody into believing that an email is legitimate, but is actually a malicious email cut with a malicious attachment or malicious link. And then detection advice. How could you detect spear phishing? Well, URL inspection within the email body, or detonation chambers, where if you do suspect a link, you can detonate it within a sandbox and then gather any IOCs or intelligence from that information. So, again, attack is definitely something you want to be looking into. And it's something that, we've at Adarma been playing with for a while. And if you'd like to look at some interesting sources, I would recommend looking into the Magma use case framework. I'd recommend looking into Sigma, which I'm going to show you a screenshot of in a little minute or two. And so what we did is we took that attack framework and we said, okay, this is great, we love it, but fundamentally it's a big document repository. How do we turn it into something that we can operationalize? And that's where we built what we called at the time our use case management system, which is now called the Countermeasures management platform, which we now use to manage all of our rules for all of our remote SOC customers. So it's got hundreds, if not probably close to 1,000 in now. And it looks a bit like this. So we start at the top with which attacker technique we're targeting with our countermeasure. So in this example, that's use of valid accounts, technique 1078. Our countermeasure is then what threat activity we're looking for based on the above technique and its procedure. For example, use of default accounts, which is a sub-technique of use of valid accounts. And then we write our rules, what specific activity we're attempting to detect based on event data. So as an example, we monitor whether default accounts have been used. And those logs could be from something like Active Directory, from the Windows event log, from Octalogs, from network devices, which always come hard-coded with default accounts. I'm looking at you, Cisco. So that extrapolated out to thousands of rules enable us now to have a library where at the top level we might have use of valid accounts as a directory, underneath there use of default accounts, and then underneath there we might have 10 different rules looking at different types of data and try and analyze it in different ways to alert on that type of specific threat activity. And I can't show you exactly what that looks like because it's internal IP, but I can show you the open source repository Sigma, which attempts to do something very similar. And so what you get is rich YAML or XML configuration, which you can then deploy at scale. And as you can see in the Sigma rule, you've got all sorts of really rich metadata, which helps you understand what's the attacker doing, what log data might you need to detect it, what are some of the actual application activity? For example, if dev null is in the logs with that particular type, that is an indicator of detecting overwriting, wiping and deleting, which is why it's monitoring, dev null and dev zero. Are there any potential false positives? Well, yes, there are. Legitimate overwriting of files. and so on and so forth. And I love the reference because it's referencing then further contextual information that you can use as a detection engineer or a SOC analyst to understand the research behind this. So going back to my example of if we're trying to improve our effectiveness or our efficiencies, so at the threat modeling stage, we've got a huge amount of threat awareness from the beginning. Okay, so we're stepping into a situation where we have a huge amount of situational awareness about what's occurring on a global scale. We then understand possible data sources we might need to onboard and use to detect it. And so then when we need to make our configuration change, because we've mapped to this, we can have a standardized naming convention where if we use the TID, we can instantly map that back to that rich body of knowledge. And it gives us, even tips on how we might write a detective control or write a search. And then when we actually, as an analyst, get an alert for that, well, our ability to triage and provide context is, again, very rich because we can reference that huge body of knowledge instantaneously. And with the way we do it is we automatically put a link with the alert into our case management platform. So if an analyst isn't familiar with what T1075 is, don't blame them. They can click on it and instantly have that rich knowledge base of going, oh, that's Kerber roasting. And they can, within 30 seconds, know enough, hopefully, to do their job about Kerber roasting. And if they're asked, tired of Kerber roasting alerts, how do attackers keep doing this? Straight away, well, there's a number of things we could do to mitigate this. We can encrypt sensitive information, and we can have better password policies. Oh, what does that mean? Well, if you read this knowledge base, you will find more about it. Oh, thank you so much. And something that could have taken hours worth of research, documentation, and discovery now becomes just part of a continuous improvement cycle, an operation cycle, which can be, significantly enhance what you're trying to achieve. If you think that from Adarma's perspective, we've got 20 or so remote customers in our remote SOC. So for each one of those customers, rather than asking each one, so what are you worried about? How would we detect that? We can start with, well, we have, close to 1,000 rules, the vast majority of which are mapped to attack. What things are you worried? You're worried about Kerber roasting. We've got 20 rules that are in a version control system where if we click a few buttons, we'll automatically deploy them into Splunk for you. Fully audited, peer reviewed. We have unit testing. It's great. And so we're massively more efficient and effective because of the adoption of 4 key things outside of attack anyway. So agile development, moving away from waterfall, where you have huge design sessions or design for weeks on end, and then go into testing and then implement, we now have moved to using Scrum, where we have short development and release cycles. We have full version control in all of our configuration. Version control is essentially like track changes in Microsoft Word. It enables us to see right from the original prototype or idea all the way through to what was produced and validated and tested into production, what happened, what were the mistakes, when did it change? And it means that if we're changing something that's already in production, we can very quickly roll back because we have the previous commit history and we can straight away see that maybe a 5 was changed to a 50 by mistake in the last development cycle. Configuration management, so the ability to actually take what's in that version control system and to deploy it at scale to many different places. So rather than directly SSHing or RDPing or even logging into Splunk Web, we use either a mixture of Ansible and some of our own scripts to do it for us. So all of our code is then under management. One of the version control system, of which at the moment we're using GitLab, and then the configuration management system, which, as I said, we use Ansible and a mixture of some of our custom stuff, which then enable us to do that. So now we have what would be considered a full route to live. We're able to say, we've tested this in a development environment. It's now gone through a full test or pre-production stage, and it's now been deployed, meaning that our code base is almost identical throughout all environments and indeed all customers. So we take away so much of the, custom configuration, custom code, bespoke scripts, bespoke that. And by standardizing, it makes us so much more scalable. So that individual detection engineer can do a huge amount more work because they're leveraging on this really rich and strong foundation. So that's the end of me talking about security operations. I do have about 10, 15 minutes worth of content on common SOC roles and competencies, but now is possibly a good time to break. Rich, do you think, just to cover questions about this part first and then see if we've got time for that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Okay,
You
brilliant.
got the questions from your Slido.
So I can see a bunch of stuff in the chat, and let me.
So feel free to turn on your cameras and microphones now. And anyone got any just general questions for Harry on what we've been talking about? SOC operation management, SOC center.
Yeah, I've got I think 10 in Slido as well.
Okay, we could do some of those, but yeah, I mean, chip in anyone. It's always good if you turn your cameras on. It's not brilliant to be staring at blank screens, especially for Q&A. So feel free to just chip in with some questions if you want. If anyone's awake still, they'll get there.
Well, feel free to interrupt me, but I'll start with some of the Slido questions. There's a few that are around the competency stuff, which I will cover. So I'll skip those questions for now, and if I don't answer them in my next few slides, we'll come back to them. So the one of the top rated questions is, what is the most common attack on large enterprises we have to deal with? I would say the top three, I don't know what order they would be in, but the top three would definitely be ransomware, denial of service, and credential stuffing or mass credential abuse. So it depends on the type of customer, what type of attack they often see. So for example, we do a huge amount of work for a very large online e-retailer. They often have probably delivered most of us some of our food during lockdown, but I'll not name who they are. And they have a huge challenge with credential stuffing, because what attackers do is they go and they buy or find a bunch of stolen or leaked credentials, say for the LinkedIn breach from 2015, where loads of people's email addresses and passwords were compromised, and they'll replay those credentials against other legitimate services, hoping to defraud them. And so the actual, I guess, objective against an e-retailer is fraud. They want to defraud them by using other people's credit cards to buy vouchers, buy food, etc., or even validate the credential works and then sell them on to somebody else who might be more local to the area. And that's how organized crime would use it, is that they would then bunch it up and say, here's 200 legitimate logins in the Edinburgh region, and a local crime area would then go and abuse them over an evening before anyone cottoned on, either get a bunch of food incorrectly delivered, change the card, get it refunded to a different card perhaps. They're always looking for ways to defraud. Ransomware, you're probably all familiar with. So the crypto locking of files or systems, and then demanding some form of ransom to unlock them. In some cases also, that is the theft of files, locking of the local ones, and then threatening to release them publicly. That's definitely more common these days. And what was the third one I said? So denial of service. So, essentially trying to say, we'll take your bank offline, we'll take your mobile banking app or whatever else offline if you don't pay. And then, so that may not necessarily be combating an attack, but it will be things like, what is the situational awareness? What are the protective controls that are in place to mitigate? Are we even vulnerable to that? Could they take us offline? So that's more of a threat intelligence piece.
I've got just a sort of aside to that. So those are the real attacks that you deal with. Any ideas on the sort of, I guess, kind of false positives, like what's happening all the time that now the automated systems now get rid of or deal with or don't alert to, or the things that the analysts don't really deal with but are happening all the time? I always think those are interesting.
So split into two halves. So one would be so non-malicious but still triggering activity, and that comes down to two things. One is user behavior, so basically people doing things they shouldn't do, but non-maliciously.
Phones and things, maybe.
Sorry?
Phones and things like that, maybe.
Yeah, phones, trying to send stuff home just to work on it at home. Obviously with COVID-19, it's a bit different, but because a lot of remote workers, but yeah, so people doing activity that's often dumb or against policy, but doing it non-maliciously. And then the other would be poor IT hygiene. So for example, if you're a large bank and you have 200,000 endpoints and 40,000 servers, are you sure you're not using default accounts in any of them? Are you sure they're all patched? Are you sure they're all up to date in your asset spreadsheet that there's 50,000 versions of? So that basic IT hygiene can be a big one. Are all of them receiving AV updates? Are you sure? When was the last time you checked? That's a big one. You've said this is a Windows server. I've just logged onto it. It's a Linux server. So all the alerting that's deployed, which is looking for Windows type attacks, probably not applicable. So IT hygiene is a massive problem for false positives, because you go, we're under attack. No, you're not. You're attacking the web server. That's a database server. So those kind of things where, you essentially get a rule triggered, but it's a non-issue from an attack perspective, but obviously someone in IT is going to have a bad day.
Yeah, I always wonder if, things, I was thinking things like phones are updated, you get a new version of iOS and it starts sending certain protocols that maybe you don't know about, or, well, there's a few examples of where, where they're reporting on things and it's going through firewalls or going through networks that yeah, these things aren't, they have to be filtered out. Otherwise they cause a lot of false positives. Yeah. So it's quite interesting, the spread of things that are dealt with, and the changes, the sort of changes we see year to year.
Yeah. Okay, so another question, how's the SOC handled COVID? So the vast majority of our teams were able to go remote. We had preparations in place with all but one of our SOCs. So one of our large SOCs was an on-site SOC, meaning that the customer, had a dedicated room, space, etc. And that particular customer hadn't prepared for a full remote operation. They had a DR site, so a completely mirrored room, servers, functionality in another city, but they didn't have the ability to go remote. So that particular customer had a bit of a bad few weeks as they very quickly tried to buy a whole lot of laptops, provision them, write accesses, VPNs. But our remote SOC, we pretty much just closed the laptops and went home. As such is the platform we've built. So we're heavily based in AWS. So it's essentially a remote SOC capability, which, yeah, worked surprisingly well. It was not a situation, we'd drilled a whole much. We did have a go bag, which helped. But yeah, it was a good test of our DR and business continuity, and it worked pretty well. Since obviously there've been some challenges around, some people not having adequate equipment at home, monitors, desks, chairs, but we've pretty much solved those problems now by our head of IT just driving around with a van and delivering a whole bunch of equipment to people. Oh, wrong button. How often do you think you and your team have had to innovate your methods to stay ahead of the game due to your current tools and methods not being enough? How often have we had to? Not very often. How often should we? All the time. So when we built our remote SOC, which is the one I work the closest with, we essentially did it on a shoestring. There were people within our previous company that owned us that kind of said, well, that's going to cost $1 million plus to build. We're not going to unlock all that money. So you've got a smaller amount. So, just do what you can. And we did. And what it meant is that we're able to launch, got our first customer, which is always the hardest, and built up from there. But it did mean that, let's say, we'd not necessarily built the most mature SOC that we could have. So what we essentially had was a bunch of debt carried forward And that debt only really got addressed in the last 18 months. So there was quite a lot of debt that we'd kind of just like built on top of, but ignored for a bit of time. And that's where, you know, my program about improving effectiveness, improving efficiency has started to, together with the people I work with, transform the SOC into a much more agile place where you don't have a rule live in production for 3 years and it's never been checked since. You know, you've got much more continuous loops and cycles to improve on it. Yeah, so I'm not going to skip permanently. I'm just going to skip for now the ones about roles and competencies, because I will cover a bit of that. Automation, you mentioned earlier, is the use of Phantom and playbooks, which collates all the information as well as alerts the right people, ? Yes, so Phantom as a SOAR platform essentially does case management, workflow, and an automation. So the way that would work in practice is an alert comes into Phantom, and Phantom, almost like a queue, says there is a new case to be reviewed. Now, that's either going to be reviewed by a person or it's going to be reviewed by Phantom itself as a first step. Now, that is what you're aiming for. You want all your what's called tier 1 analysis to be reviewed by the computer, because you want it to do the basic steps first, especially things that are highly repetitive. So what we now have is an alert comes in, say it's got an IP address of a potential threat actor. Maybe it's also got a hash of a process, and perhaps it's got a internal user device and username. So what you need to do is you need to run the IP address through some open source intelligence tools like VirusTotal. You might do the same with the hash. Internally, you want to know what that asset is. So is that a Windows machine, a Linux machine? Is it a mobile device? And who is that user? Are they the CEO? Are they the CFO? Do they have access to all of our financial systems? Or is it a cleaner who just has a login to their email account? And so what you want is Phantom to go and speak to VirusTotal over its API, speak to your Active Directory to pull information about the user, speak to ServiceNow, which is your CMDB, and pull all that information into the case so that when the analyst looks at it, they go, oh, so that IP address is a known Tor exit node. That hash is Conficker. That internal user is one of our financial controllers who has access to our bank accounts, and the device they're using is on Windows 7. And for some reason, they weren't part of the upgrade program. Okay, alarm bells ringing. This is probably something really impactful that we need to move on now. Now, if all of that context come back and it goes IP address 0 out of whatever it is, 70 for threat activity, the hash comes back as benign or unknown. The user doesn't have, really permissive permissions, and their device is coming up as patched. It's still threat activity. It's still to be further investigated, but it's all about your response. That now goes, okay, I'm going to look into it a bit more. I'm not going to press the incident button, and I'm going to try and gather more information. And that's for me, really how we use the automation.
Do you think that automation's then changing the kind of jobs that maybe graduates would go into? Do you mean maybe the jobs are getting a little bit more skilled and more interesting? And
I hope so. I mean, I think that's the objective. I don't think that's where we're at now. When I describe some of this, some of what I'm describing is the vision, and what we do in some customers with some cases. There are many more customers and many more environments that are far behind that curve. Some of that is due to us not pushing the innovation. A lot of it is due to the customer being quite slow to respond and want to invest, because of course, more technology, more servers, more storage, all of these things cost money, more skills. I think, and I hope, where we're moving to within Adarma and broader within the industry is exactly that, in that we're going to be able to equip people to actually join into positions where they do more shadowing up front, but at a level, what a tier 2 analysts, it's more of a senior analyst, where they're much more responsible for the understanding of threat activity, for hypothesizing new detective controls. They're empowered to construct change within the system, and not just a consumer of a bunch of really low quality alerts, which is the current state in a lot of places.
Yeah, so much more kind of analysis and research and exploration, which is much
exactly.
more
Ticket fatigue, alert fatigue, common terms, as is, ticket monkeys, which is, in some respects almost offensive because they're doing an important job, but it is repetitive. It's where I started. I got RSI after 3 months because of the amount of screenshots I was taking and copying and pasting into Excel sheets. That was how I had to close down cases back then. We've moved on away from there, but in some areas they're still quite legacy driven in the view of that. And we're trying at Adarma to push those customers into a different way of thinking and saying, like, invest in automation for the low fidelity, low quality stuff, high throughput, and free up these talented individuals. And if they're not talented, then let's put them on some training and get them talented and make them into good security practitioners, not just help desk type people.
Yeah, and obviously our students and graduates can help themselves by developing those types of skills as well. So the more exploration and investigation and reporting and all of which you'll obviously go on to talk about, but I'm just highlighting because they're doing their coursework at the moment, and yeah, it's quite important, I think. So just a quick question before you move on, from Amanda in the chat. She's asking, should it all be just fully automated now?
Mm-hmm.
So that's probably something Amanda could focus on for our dissertation, fully automating the SOC procedures.
So I think we're a very long way away from machines being able to fully automate anything that involves some form of complexity. They are very good at, very repetitive, relatively Boolean logic style tasks, if this, then that. And you can chain those together in ways which kind of almost give the illusion of intelligence. Obviously, there's some outliers with some of the work IBM's done, Google's done, where they've managed to develop things using neural networks and, unsupervised machine learning that is perhaps more advanced. I have yet to see any real application of that kind of AI or indeed automation within security that works to any real extent in the real world. The reason of which is because of the fact that we're fighting against adversaries, and our adversaries change all the time. And I'm not just talking about, putting some code through a polymorphic transform engine that gives it a different hash or a few different, assembly functions that are switched out for others and a bit of obfuscation of code. The mature ones, the nation states, the cyber criminals, and probably a few smart script kiddies, they sit back and they watch these lectures. They watch what the defenders are doing. They look at the MITRE attack framework and go, well, that's interesting. And they work against it, right? So, they are theorizing, hypothesizing, they are doing their research, they're collecting their data and putting it in Splunk, right? So we're fighting an arms race in that sense. Now, again, computers aren't so good at trying to predict something that's coming, which is where you need, human ingenuity and ideation to hypothesize, to not to predict because, we're not Mystic Meg, but to try our best to hone our skills and our predictions to what might occur and then set up defense in depth to prepare for it.
Yeah, I love reading the machine learning research papers where they say they've solved it. It's a 99.9%. We fixed this. We can cross correlate on the attack chain, on the kill chain, and we can see 0 days coming. Then obviously the attackers, the APT groups read that paper and say, okay, well, what information do we need to feed into this machine learning system to make it think that everything's benign?
It's not that it can't be helpful, but for me, it's just one more data point, So yes, run some structured or unstructured machine learning against test data sets or real data sets and try to come up with anomalous and behavioral based detections. But they've got to be one type of detection, again, with your signature based, your threshold based your lookups, you've got to bring all these things into one place to all provide, context, correlation, and kind of the cornerstone, which is a risk-based view on what's occurring. The other big problem with machine learning in real enterprise environments is the quality of the data. So that IT hygiene issue I mentioned, if you teach a machine learning system on poor quality data, then the results out the other end are likely to be quite low fidelity. And you've got the exact same problem of a whole bunch of false positives. So where was the improvement? And so, yeah, you've got to definitely be really cautious in thinking that these things are a panacea or, a quick fix. But you can apply automation to the high volume, repetitive tasks as a first step on that journey to automation. But I don't believe you'll ever fully automate the job of a cybersecurity practitioner in the defensive domain, because you can't predict the future, and I don't think computers will ever be able to do so either. But we're much better at being flexible and learning on our feet.
People want to have a look at this. There's lots of research into hybrid systems, looking at all different things to predict ransomware and cross correlate kill chain, new attacks and things. If you go back to the original paper where the kill chain was introduced by Lockheed Martin, I don't know when that was, like 15 years ago or something, you'll see that it predicts that the kill chain can be used to correlate any new attacks, and it'll solve all the problems. So it's quite interesting to go back to that and have a look at those TTPs that it describes, which are now being fleshed out and used in the MITRE attack.
Yeah, I think what Lockheed Martin did was, great as far as, an initial foray into it, and looking at what the army did as far as, that's where the term kill chain comes from. It's kind of why I prefer the term attack chain, because kill is quite final. But yeah, and what attack's done is they've expanded across that. They've pulled the steps out a bit further into kind of, pre-execution, and they've tried to provide a lot more context as what actually occurs in each one. I'm now going to, just because a lot of the remaining questions are around roles and competencies, so I'm just going to share a few slides. If we've got time, Rich, is that okay?
Yeah, I think we can just spill over into the lab time a little bit. That's fine, yeah.
Brilliant. I don't think it would take too long, but I think this will answer some of the questions, possibly not all of them, and I'll still try and have 5 minutes at the end just to cover some more. So first of all, going to cover what I see as some common roles within a SOC. SOC is not the only place you can go after university to start your career. It is a common place, especially if you're not going down the pen testing, red teaming route. And so I thought I'd cover some of those common roles. So in that first and second tier, often people join as a support analyst or a junior analyst. Security analyst would then be, as I mentioned earlier, possibly being more of that, high throughput, checking through alerts, adding context to them, quite repetitive. As SOCs are maturing, that's of course becoming a more empowered role where you're doing more continuous improvement and development of the systems themselves. A senior security analyst just typically means the same type of job, but with a bit more responsibility, perhaps more experience. Tier 2/3, this is when you start to get either more specialized as a SOC specialist, where you perhaps might specialize on endpoint and be the expert in ransomware and the expert in pulling apart EDR software or Windows event logs to try and detect what's been going on. It could be as a security engineer. So that's going to be more around either building the underlying platforms. So that could be all about Splunk. It could be a detection engineer where your expertise is understanding data and trying to build detective searches and controls that can alert the SOC to threat activity. Or it could be an incident investigator. So that could be more on the forensic side where you're saying, you might have had a background in forensics, or you may have just worked your way up as an analyst and done some certification and some courses, but it's going to be where during an incident you're specialized in actually getting to the root of the truth, what has actually occurred. So an alert said there's been a brute force, why, what's the timeline, mapping it to standard kind of NIST phases and understanding what occurred at every different phase. In the more management side, so these typically tend to be less technical roles, but still as important. Many SOCs work in 24/7 configuration, meaning they have shifts. You'll often have a shift leader who is there to provide support, guidance, and monitoring of the shift team, making sure that escalations are handled well and covers. It's not necessarily the most exciting role, but it can be a good role, especially if you're not strong technically and if you want to be a practitioner, but you're not necessarily wanting to go too deep in the technology. Incident managers, again, sometimes they have a technical background, sometimes they don't. They are the people that fundamentally orchestrate and manage the incident. So they'll be the person that's telling the incident investigator, the security analyst, the specialist, you do this, you do that, and they'll be the people keeping the business up to date in what's happening. So incident management goes from small incidents where, it might simply just be, some credential stuffing's happening. How do we fix this forward, through to full on major crisis management? Our entire customer database is gone. What are we going to do about it? And they'll sit there and they'll face off to the business, the legal team, the PR team, but they'll also face off to the SOC and the security responders to make sure everyone understands what they're trying to do. And then finally, the SOC manager, sometimes called service manager, they tend to own the full thing from an accountability perspective. They'll be responsible for recommending and promoting changes to the underlying technology, people, and process. They'll be the person that is responsible for the governance. If you go back to what I said earlier about people, process, technology, and governance being a key part of a service. They'll often also be the person who's responsible for generating the metrics, so the service metrics, so number of alerts, number of true positives, number of changes into the system, etc. So some of the common responsibilities, some of these I've already mentioned really, but and that kind of entry-level role, the analyst roles, security monitoring, event triage, especially that first tier, very common responsibility, will often take up the majority of an entrant's time. Instant escalation, so knowing when to press the button. You're seeing activity within an alert, within an event that you think is threat activity. Well, then you will invoke the incident process, and you'll often be asked to then support the incident investigator or incident manager. So you're not necessarily just passing it off. You're often going to be involved in the incident as well. Supporting service transition. So this is as things move into the SOC and sometimes out of. So new responsibilities, new parts of the business to detect. If they just acquired another business, okay, well, how do you bring on all those logs in? So you might have to support that transition, make sure that things are done right. And then for me, the most important one, continual improvement. We will always make mistakes. We will always learn from those mistakes, hopefully. And what we have to do is fix them forward. So if you see an error in a document, if you see an alert that's misconfigured, fix it forward under change control in the right way, but do fix it. Don't just sit there with the same problem. And that applies to, again, people, process, and technology. When you were onboarded, was the documentation out of date? Okay, well, 6 months in, why don't you go back and fix it? Is the process out of date? And everyone goes, oh, you don't follow that part of the document. Well, then update it. Is Splunk out of date? Does it need to be updated? Well, ask the people responsible if you can help them test the update in the dev environment, and then, be the champion for some of the new features. These are also great ways of differentiating yourself from your peers, because, improvement from a management perspective is, really, top priority. How do we improve things this month, this year? And within Adarma, obviously, our customers are paying us money for this service. So if we go back to them after a year of service and say, we're still doing the exact same thing you paid us to do, they're unlikely to renew us for a second year. But if we give them a long list of all these brilliant improvements we've made, well, then they're far more likely to take us up. And then finally, management reporting. So you'll rarely be responsible for delivering the reporting, but you might be responsible for trying to pull some of it together. So, running reports, dashboards, or even coming up with searches that help you correlate key KPIs or SLAs. Moving into competencies. Now, you can read competencies, you can say skills. The idea here, and this is from Adarma's lens on this particular area, is we split them into two key areas. There's technical ones and there's behavioral ones. Technical, as you can imagine, tend to involve your technical skills when it comes to cybersecurity. Behavioral, some people would refer to these as soft skills. We try not to, because we believe they are completely equal to technical competence. You can have an incredibly competent technical person, but without the right behavioral competence, they are not going to be hired. And so I think that's a really important thing for all of you to understand, is that you can be great technically, but if you're a terrible communicator, if you're rude, if you don't understand how to work within a large team, then these are not going to look great in an interview. And especially, you know, during your probation, that first 6 months in a company, some of these things will quickly be detected, and there'll be things that will become issues. So what are some technical competencies? So these being some of the things that are advantageous for you to understand, or at least know a little bit about, especially in entry-level roles. Now, the caveat here is we do not expect someone coming in from an entry-level role or who's just done, you know, an undergrad degree to be an expert in any of these areas. But what we do expect is an awareness, and hopefully, you know, some areas in which you excel in, where you've done coursework around, or where you've, you know, written a paper on. These things are really useful to understand. This isn't complete. There are always going to be things missed from these kind of lists, but these are some really useful areas that I would encourage you to look at. And fortunately, I know that quite a lot of these are within your syllabus, so that's also helpful. So I'm not going to read them all, but, you know, your basic networking, it's the base of almost everything we do these days, goes over a network somewhere, whether that be internal or external. So understanding the basics of how that works are really important, including the way we protect networks, so firewalls, web application firewalls, proxies, VPNs, etc. Endpoint, so endpoint meaning devices, mobiles, desktops, laptops, servers, understanding how these things are moving to a virtualized or even containerized platform is also quite useful. Obviously, malware, the thing used in many, if not all, attacks, the various common types or families, common patterns that they use, and obviously research tools you can use to understand more about them. And an emerging area, certainly not a new, but definitely more common, is fileless malware. So basically malware that doesn't necessarily have a binary that sits on a file system, but executes in memory or lives off the land using, you know, things like PowerShell or sysinternals tools that might already be present within the network. These are becoming more pervasive and much harder to detect because, well, PowerShell is used by all my developers. So, you know, looking for PowerShell being used is not a good way of detecting that attack, etc. Tactics and techniques. So obviously coming back to MITRE attack and the Lockheed Martin kill chain, these are phenomenal reference points. You know, I'm not asking you to go out there and learn all of attack. I don't think anyone could hold that amount of information in their brain, but understanding what these are, how they're used, and then, you know, making sure that's a bookmark on your system so that when you see something, you can very contextualize it. And then finally, the CIS common controls. These are the top 20 protective controls that all computer systems should have applied to them. There's some really interesting stuff in there. And again, if you're looking for, you know, basically the top ways you can learn as a practitioner to defend organizations, that's a really good starting point. And then finally, you know, how do we actually use these things? How do we program systems to do better? Well, that's scripting, you know, that's programming, you know, Bash or Shell, understanding how to write basic scripts in those kind of, you know, native OS languages, so to speak, really useful. Just for quick things, Python is a phenomenally powerful language. That's what Phantom uses. That's what most of Splunk modular inputs use. It's probably the most popular language used within cybersecurity that I'm aware of. An emerging one, and one that we've started using when we build our own software, is Go or Golang. Great language, and we've been using that a lot when we've been building our own systems. And then obviously, you know, database or big data technology, really, really useful, whether that's SQL, NoSQL, or big data systems like Splunk. Really, really advantageous because, you know, if someone comes to us with a background in Splunk, well, that's a bunch of training or several weeks of training we don't have to give them, and they can start faster, start bringing value to the customer faster as well. Moving on to behaviors. So these in this massively busy slide are essentially the behavioral competencies that Adarma looks for in all of its employees. Now, again, we do not expect people, especially new entrants to the market, to be experts at all of these things. But what we do expect is that some of the foundational ones, people have, a fair competence in, and then we expect that they look to grow. So for example, business insight, that's not something you're going to join a company and instantly hold a ton of business insight. A starting point for that, though, is come to the interview knowing who Adarma are. What are some of our key things that we do? How do we make our money? Who are some key people in an organization? That's the starting point. But in the first 6, 12 months, as you grow your career with Adarma, we expect you to try and learn more about it. Performance driven is pretty straightforward, taking responsibility and accountability for what you're asked to do and delivering it on time. Customer passion. Adarma is a private organization. We are all about our customers. We don't get paid without them. And our job is to help them protect themselves and to protect them on their behalf. So if we don't do that, then we're essentially completely failing at our overall mission. Innovation, and I think to one of the questions earlier, how often is innovation a requirement? It's becoming more and more. So where it used to kind of be, you could get away with business as usual. Well, that's how Lockheed Martin defined it. So we've chosen not to revise that research since it was published. No, you start with current state and you look to improve in every way you can. Communication, an absolute cornerstone of any new hire, and indeed any successful practitioner in most cases, will be that they are a good communicator. That does not mean good at all forms of communication. I am a poor written communicator. It is something that has plagued me due to my dyslexia all my life, but I have worked on it. I use tools on the computer to help me, whether that be the Open Dyslexic font or Grammarly for my grammar. So therefore I come across as a better communicator because of it. But it's making sure that you've got that self-awareness to do that. And if you struggle in areas such as verbal communication or presenting, that's fine, but identify it, identify how to improve on it, and then make sure Adarma helps you do so. Learning mindset, interconnected to a lot of the others really. But again, don't think that you're going to leave university and in any sense stop learning. If you are, you're probably not a good hire, because we're looking for people that are trying to engage in lifelong learning. You have to engage in lifelong learning to be a cybersecurity practitioner with any real sense of competence, because there are constantly evolving attackers, techniques and tactics that are being used to undermine your work. Collaborative partner, this could be really described as teamwork, right? The ability to work with others in a constructive and efficient way. If you can't do that, then unfortunately in modern business, it's going to be really hard to hire you and work with you, because fundamentally, it's very rare to have an individual who's contributes solely on their own. You are going to be working with other people, and we need people to be able to do so in an effective way. Finally, and a really important one for me when I interview people, is personal responsibility. Owning your mistakes and then driving forward with improvements. It's fine to make mistakes. I have made some pretty big mistakes in my career, at one point including hooking up by mistake a off-the-shelf Linksys access point to a corporate network, which tried to give out Class C IP addresses to 500 computers in an office, taking down their internal network for about 45 minutes. It was a bad mistake, but I learned a lot from it, and I didn't get fired because I owned up to it. I pointed out how it happened, how we would put guardrails around it never happening again. And I was actually congratulated for, well done, it was handled well, you were honest about it, the write-up was good. And so one of the worst moments in my IT career, and realizing that I had done that, turned into something that became, something I took responsibility for and was recognized for. So they're the behavioral competencies. I'm going to finish this section just with a final slide, and that is on emotional intelligence. Now, there's a fair few definitions of this. This is what I'm referring to by this, but it's kind of an extension to the behavioral competencies, and there's definitely some overlap. But these are some key areas that I would really encourage people to consider just in themselves. I think these are really helpful to people within their personal lives, and I think that they're really helpful within a professional context as well. So self-awareness has to start there, because if you can't understand your own state, whether that be your emotional state or otherwise, it's really hard to do any of the rest. Self-regulation, we all get angry, we all get upset, we all get emotional. These are normal parts of being a human, and you shouldn't try and repress them. But what you should try and do is make sure that they show themselves in the appropriate setting. That doesn't mean not at work. It just means in the right place at the right time. There are customers that I've wanted to scream at. However, that would not be so good for my career nor for Adarma's reputation. So, you know, taking a drink of water, having a pause, accepting the criticism, the critique, stepping away, going for a walk, possibly screaming when I get home, these kind of things, you know, it's self-regulation. Motivation, pretty self-evident, you know, you've got to be motivated to do your job. You've got to be motivated to be good at your job if you want to be recognized as such. And if you're not, that's a really hard thing to have in a hire, because if you're not motivated, trying to motivate someone who's not motivated to motivate themselves, it's really difficult. My personal favorite, empathy. We're all human. We all make mistakes. We all sometimes get sad. Many of us will suffer from forms of mental illness or poor mental well-being. Having the empathy to listen, to learn, and to share with others will stand anyone, I believe, or should stand anyone, I believe, in good stead. And finally, social skills. Again, not expecting anyone to have mastered these, but these are things to consider. You know, there are going to be hopefully appropriate jokes, sarcasm, and in the workplace. If they're not appropriate, that's a different problem entirely. But you know, the ability to pick up on these things, to hopefully engage with them, helps you build relationships. Not necessarily friendships. You know, they may not become your friends, but hopefully they become positive work things. And I think that's really important. Anyway, that is the end of the actual deck. You're already on Slido. I will cover some questions, but this is how you can reach me. Twitter is the easiest way, just in general. But you're welcome to reach out directly as well if you've got any further questions. And obviously, Rich and Bill know how to reach me if you'd like to go via that mechanism. So I will now just open Slido again. And I think there's been some more in the chat. So let me just quickly check the chat first. So hopefully I've covered some of the entry position competencies. So that answers that question. Having encountered instances of people deliberately crashing systems and coming in as heroes, not personally. I've heard stories of it occurring. I hope those stories were exaggerated, because yeah, I mean, that is a dangerous game to play. What else? Any additional certifications? So certifications are like anything else. They are not the only thing that should be pursued. I think it's a triangle. There's certifications, there's education, and then there's experience. And one of those things on their own are okay. Two of them, great. All three, really, really solid. So, you know, actual just certifications, there's some, yes, Splunk specific ones. So Splunk certified user, Splunk certified power user, they're pretty straightforward to get and relatively inexpensive. Most of the training is online and free. Obviously, CompTIA do a bunch of stuff, entry-level IT and entry-level security. So Security Plus, there's a one that's maybe a couple of years past that, which is it PsyOps, something like that. It's kind of security operations. And obviously there's like Pen Test Plus and so on. Later on in your career, there's you know, there's lots of ones in the pen testing domain like OSCP. There's ones more in the defender or information security hat like CISM and CISSP, but you need, you know, a bunch of experience before you qualify for those. So there would be a few, but don't discount education itself. So, you know, so do an education course and get certified. Yes. Don't just go for a cert and cram for a couple of days and get it. It's not really bringing much value to you. And most people that do that get discovered very quickly, because, you know, if I'm going to do a technical screening and you tell me you've done a cert, I'm going to ask you questions about it. I'm going to ask you, you know, talk me through how that works then. And if people can't answer, well, then you've got a cert that costs you possibly a lot of money, but you don't really know anything about the domain that it covers. So don't get certs for cert's sake, but they can be a really valuable tool, especially if one of kind of, you know, hopefully demonstrating your experience and competence.
Well, the masters guys seem to go on and do specific certs, you know, if they've focused on an area. So quite commonly, they'll go and do OSCP for pen testing after they do our master's pen testing module, and they seem to be going quite well with things like that. You know, they maybe go into a specific area.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, it's not my area of expertise, pen testing or red teaming, but you know, there's a lot of great some free resources online, as well as obviously the formal certs. Question: is SOC based on the ITIL model? So some are. So ITIL is essentially, the IT International Library, is it? Anyway, it's essentially, essentially ITIL model is a way of running IT for usually enterprises. And there's a bunch of really great standardization in it. I think I got like an ITIL certification, must be now 6 years ago. And it was really good for things like problem management, incident management, and some SOCs follow that very closely. Some don't, some kind of reinvented the wheel. NIST have got a bunch of really good resources. The cybersecurity framework from NIST is a really good starting point to learn about how that works in a SOC context. What's we got? Preparation going into kind of a new role is a top question. So I think I mentioned some of the competencies as far as ways to kind of, I guess, practice or demonstrate. Unfortunately, very few employers, if any, have the time to get to know people in any real depth. So unfortunately, it's going to be down to personal profile, CV, or an application, and then maybe 2, 3, 4 stage interview process. Practice every stage of that as much as you can. So, you know, get people to check your CV. There's 1,000+ guides online. You know, read a few of them, make sure that they're applicable to your area. So, you know, there are areas, for example, medicine, where it is quite common and acceptable to have a 10, 15, 20-page CV. That is not acceptable in cybersecurity, or at least it's not with any job I've ever looked at or interviewed for, and I've interviewed a lot of people. If your CV is more than 2 pages, I'm very unlikely to look at it more than, you know, I'm going to look at the first page and then I'm going to glance at the second page, because I do not have the time to look through 200 CVs and spend half an hour reading through the whole thing. It's an unfortunate fact of the process. Same with in the interview, you know, come prepared. Make sure you understand the ask, you know, so ask the recruiter, you know, what's to be expected, who's interviewing me, do a bit of research on them, not a creepy amount of research, by the way, but, you know, look them up on LinkedIn, what are their interests, you know, have they published any work or given any talks that you could maybe look at a synopsis for that lets you know the kind of thing they might be looking at. You know, if you're being interviewed by me, for example, you can go and look at 30+ presentations that I've done, and you'll kind of, hopefully, just by sampling a couple of them, understand he's really into security operations. Likes a lot of Splunk. Better make sure I bring that up in the interview when I'm asked about experience. You know, just figure out ways to relate to your interviewers. They're just people. It's a scary process, but they're just people. And practice in your interviews, especially if you're not familiar with going through that. You know, so ask a friend, a colleague, a lecturer, if they're willing to do a mock interview. You know, and ask them to be adversarial, ask them to be a bit of a dick, so that you can prepare yourself and hope that that doesn't happen in reality. And it obviously shouldn't, but it means that you're at least prepared for it.
Well, we also have a lot of graduates, and we know a lot of people who work in these companies. So, you know, we can put you in touch with people who maybe work at Adarma or have experience or been there a few years, or Harry himself, you know, or I mean, there's a whole range of things.
Definitely, you know,
Harry's really emphasised Twitter as well. You know, I mean, I don't think there's as many students as maybe used to use Twitter, but I mean, it's a good way of keeping up with what's going on, keeping up with events, what's happening in the industry, attacks, talks and things.
If people present the opportunity, engage with them. You know, Cybersecurity Connect runs a Slack group. You've now got an open invitation to join that Slack group, and you can find the details on our website. Just Google Cybersecurity Connect, and I think the link's in the chat.
You know,
if you've got a question and you've got people like me or all the people in Cybersecurity Connect, all the moderators, we have all said multiple times, you know, if you need something, let us know. We'll do our best. You know, it's not free support 24/7, but if we can help, we will. And, you know, many of us have helped refer people into jobs, or we've done mock interviews for a few people. I've reviewed a few people's CVs for them. You know, it's not unlimited because we all have limited time. But, you know, if the offers are there, take people up on it.
I think probably almost every event there's jobs talked about, isn't there, in companies, and you know, you get that insight into who is around, who's doing security, what they do, who's involved, how you contact them. So I think all of these things dipping in and out. I mean, we're not expecting students to spend every day on Twitter or go to every single event, but you know, being aware of these groups and you know, which companies are hiring, who does what, you know, who's involved is really important.
Yeah. So a question was, in the current situation of the world, what do you think is a good path for those of us who want to break into computer security? Obviously, you know, we're experiencing a global economic downturn. We have a horrific pandemic that's facing the whole world. So there is a huge amount of uncertainty. I would say three things, because I'm a consultant, so everything's in threes. One is, you know, keep working on yourself where you can. We all have, as far as I'm concerned, diminished capacity right now, emotionally or otherwise, due to everything that's going on. I certainly do. There's a whole bunch of projects and education I wanted to achieve this year that I'm not. But, you know, you've got to be kind to yourself and realize that these are pretty uncertain times. So work on yourself wherever you can to make yourself as attractive as a hire as possible to break into the world. Two, in some cases, depending on your experience, your competence, you may have to settle for a first job that, you know, isn't that dream job. As I said, you know, my first job as a security analyst was pretty rough. It was really bad level 1, terrible compliance alerts for the first 18 months. It was a really bad shift rotor that we've fortunately very much improved on. It was using Windows XP. Bear in mind, Windows 7 was out, but it was XP. You know, didn't have dual monitors, you know, all these issues. The room had mold in it. It was not nice at Site Hill as well. But within 18 months, due to, you know, the improvements I suggested, due to kind of me standing out, I was promoted into security engineer and then had over £10,000 of Splunk training thrown at me within 18 months time period. You know, so although I didn't get the dream job, although I was very grateful for it, within 18 months later, you know, I'd had a £5,000 pay rise, and I was now doing something that I really enjoyed and found super interesting. A year later from there, again, because I did that one well, I was then traveling around the UK, which has its pros and cons. But, you know, I spent 2.5 years traveling around over, I think, 30 different of some of the largest enterprises in the UK, from, you know, EE, Burberry, Co-op, Lloyd's, RBS, you know, UCAS, which was a fantastically interesting customer. There's no other business like them in the UK. You know, all of that was due to basically starting with a boring job. It was very poorly paid. It's much better paid now, but it was the first time they did it, so they didn't have a lot of money. So whatever. I got paid more on my placement year than I did with my first job. But I took it, and then I went on from there. There has been a trend of some entry people coming in and expecting a significant amount of money, a significant amount more than what I would call the baseline. And I think it's really important to base your expectations in reality. It's not that in a relatively short period of time, those figures could definitely materialize, but I think it's really important, unless you are exceptional, which some of you may well be, you know, to stake yourself in reality. And also, especially with everything that's going on, you know, starting somewhere, foot in the door, even if you move on into a different company in a year, you know, I would just go for it. You know, make sure it's an employer that treats you with respect. So, you know, I'm not suggesting just jump to bed with anybody, but, you know, I think that there's the vision, and there's the marketing around cybersecurity jobs, and some of it's true, but some of it is a bit over-egged, and some roles are made to appear far more initially interesting than they might be, especially within your first couple of years. Security operations being one sometimes, you know, where you see people, defenders, and there's things bouncing around on a Nord map and stuff that's just complete rubbish. Same with pen testers, who again, it's like, entry role into pen testers is not likely to mean you're going to be doing red teaming on site, breaking into someone's desk and, getting rubber duckies and throwing them in the car park. It's going to be 90% in Microsoft Word, writing up reports, possibly of work that other people did. So, I'm not trying to discourage you from either of those. I'm just saying that keep your expectations grounded in reality, speak to people that actually do these jobs, especially that have maybe done them in the last few years. So they're grounded again in current day, and then go for it and leverage building industry contacts, going to events as a way to, hopefully give you a bit of a leg up. I can't help but naturally empathize a little bit with someone I'm interviewing that I've met at an event 2 weeks beforehand. It's natural for me to go, I actually had a great 20-minute chat with them amongst other people. They seemed friendly, they were smart. I don't mean suit smart. I just mean, casually smart. They presented themselves in a good way, which is important to me because I have customers that are going to meet with you. That's a great way. Obviously we can't do it physically, so it's not as ideal, but yeah.
Any sort of specific questions about kind of jobs, roles, skills, competencies, soft skills? We're not allowed to call it that, but I can't remember what you got. Is it behavioral competencies?
Behavioral skills or core skills? I think core skills is probably the best term for it.
Come on, switch on your mic. Someone ask a question.
Hi, Harry. I actually would like to ask you something that I'm pretty interested in. So, for instance, talking particularly about Adarma, does the company invest in employees development? How does it do that if it does? And also, do they expect you to do all the learning outside work, outside your working hours? Or do they have, let's say, maybe once every 3-4 weeks, they'll have some sort of a course, or maybe send employees to seminars? It's what is their policy in terms of employment development?
Sure. So one of what I think is a huge benefit of working in a private sector company, and I would say that as I chose to do so, is, to be blunt, you're the product. Right? Adarma, we don't have an app that you can buy and download. We don't really build software that people purchase. We sell services that are based around people. Now, those people need technology and they need a bunch of stuff, but fundamentally it's people. So if we have a person, and let's for argument's say that Adarma sells them at a certain rate, and this is often how it works in professional services anyway, and there will literally be a day rate attached to every person in professional services. So I had a day rate, and a customer could pay an amount per day and get my time to help them. So what's better for Adarma? To keep me, at the same level with the same skills, or to add skills on top and then increase the rate? So how that works in reality is, say I was a security engineer, and this is an example, not reality, but say I was a security engineer and say I was on 25K a year, and Adarma was charging £250 a day for my time. If I go away and do a SANS course or become a Splunk architect, they know that they can now charge £400 a day for me. So they might give me a £5,000 pay increase, which I love because that's a nice bump from 25 to 30K. They get a nice bump because their revenue, by going from 250 to 400, £150 extra a day, roughly 250 working days a year. So their books look great, my bank account looks great, and the customer's now getting a Splunk architect they need. So for private sector that engages in that kind of in the cybersecurity private sector anyway, it's advantageous for employers to make their employees into the best version of themselves. They're incentivized to do so. Now, if you go and work for a bank, you're a cost. You don't make a bank money. You're a cost. It costs them money because they want to invest in their security. But if you work for private sector cybersecurity, their business is cybersecurity, and therefore, by hiring you, they're making more money. And I think that's a really good relationship.
Does that mean then that would you recommend that once we graduate, we try to find a position into sort of a private security company to maybe to be able to learn more and make ourselves more worthy, instead of going to a big bank that you said that they just look at us like. I think
it depends on the person, right? Now, I'm an advocate for private sector because it is what I chose to do, and it's worked out very well for me. But there are good reasons to want to work in the public sector, and there are good reasons to want to work in the private sector, but not for a cybersecurity company like a bank. Now, you are going to have often, not always, but often more job security, potentially better pensions, and often work in much larger teams if you work for a large enterprise like a bank. Okay. There are some people out there, it may not be any of you, but it may well be some of you, and that's also fine, that would like a job where the pace is perhaps a little slower, where there's perhaps less emphasis on, we need people to be better, because Adarma really incentivizes and pushes our people to grow, because as I mentioned, it's in our commercial best interest to do so, as well as us wanting to be a good caretaker of people's careers. Now, a bank may not do that, but that might be okay. If you've got a family, if you've got other commitments, or if, there are things in life that you struggle with, you actually might want a bit of a safer, less intense job. And that's fine. That's absolutely fine. In which case, private sector cybersecurity might not be as appropriate as perhaps a bank, or perhaps you really believe in public service, in which case, yeah, you might end up with a lower salary, but perhaps your other rewards like pension, like insurance, might be better if you go and work for the Scottish government, for example. There's a lot to be said for doing that and defending the nation, the literal nation, against adversaries is a great thing to dedicate your time to. So, I'm an advocate for private sector cybersecurity, but I think that there's very respectable reasons to look everywhere. It just depends on you.
Thanks for the answer, Harry. Thank you.
No worries. Thanks for the question.
We did have one key question, Harry, which we can't miss. Someone was asking them what the cat's name is.
Yeah. So her name is Keanu Reeves.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, my partner decided that her name would be Keanu Reeves, so we call her Keanu, Constantine, John, Neo, just pretty much any of the characters that Keanu Reeves has played. So the vet is a little confused when we registered her as Keanu Reeves, but we kind of pointed out that, names are a societal construct anyway, so it's fine.
Also some good reactions in the chat.
Yeah, no, she's very cute. Rehomed a week and a half ago, and she's so far managed to somehow, in a couple of my calls over the last week, sleep on my shoulder during a conference call, which is quite impressive.
Well, I think I might have seen a picture of a black cat. Yeah.
That
rings a bell. Either that or I dreamt it. One of the two.
Definitely been on Twitter a couple of times.
About cats on shoulders, Rich? That's a bit weird.
Well, yes. I don't remember looking at him. I'm on Twitter an awful lot recently, but I do remember.
Yeah, she's very cute.
I must have seen it somewhere.
There were a couple more questions in Slido. How popular is red teaming, pen testing? Honestly, I couldn't tell you how popular it is. I know that there are also obviously some big people that hire in that space. Some of the big four consultancies do that as part of their global business. Obviously, NCC does a huge amount of that kind of work, and I think they're primarily based out of Manchester. In Scotland, there are some what I'd call smaller boutiques that do pen testing and do really good work and hire some great people. I don't know if there's a massive opportunity for it in Scotland, but again, that could be wrong. I've just not, the people I went to university with, the jobs I see advertised, I don't see a huge amount of it in Scotland, which possibly means you'll have to move if you want to pursue it. Obviously, lots of value in some of the skills you get. So understanding how adversaries think and work, which is obviously what a red teamer pen tester is trying to emulate, highly advantageous for a blue teamer, because of course you're trying to defend against those people. And so, knowing your enemy and all that is really useful. So even if you don't plan on practicing pen testing or red teaming, really good skills to learn. I did my certified ethical hacker whenever it was 6 years ago, and and not an entry-level cert, but certainly not an OSCP as far as practical skills. But it was really useful for me to just understand and play with some of the tools, as of course was some of the lab work we did at Napier back in the day.
So it seems to be quite dynamic. You know, the companies are changing. Companies buy each other. There's a lot of moving around in terms of pen testing, red team, and stuff. It's almost not settled down as far as I can see. But what I'm hearing is there's quite a lot of red teaming, as Harry says, that becomes part of other jobs. So, you know, you mentioned purple teaming at the beginning. So that's becoming more popular. You know, we have pen testers which are working with your defenses. So not testing and then telling the defenders what's wrong and they have to go and fix it, or making suggestions, but actually working in the company together. So they'll be doing periodic testing, which feeds directly into defenses, and maybe grey box testing and things where things are changed during tests. So I think that's maybe the way it's going, where it will be embedded into other jobs and maybe jobs that will incorporate a lot of these different skills.
Yeah, if you're looking for quite an interesting area, really, I guess an extension or a subpart of purple teaming would be something called like continual control testing or control assurance. So there's a number of projects. One's called Attack Range. The other is, I think, Caldera. And what these tools do is they set up environments, like distributed environments using like Terraform or Ansible, that then simulate based on, you know, attack and use cases as code. So, you know, deployed all via Git, all from Git, entire environments to simulate attack and detection to then let you know what happened. So it will say, you know, run technique 1075, which whatever it might be, spear phishing, and the sandbox will generate a spear phishing email, which is received into a mailbox on a example, you know, Windows device with a simulated user clicking on it, and it will test to see if your controls detected it. And so that for me is, it's kind of like the evolution of traditional pen testing, which tended to be quite scripted, you know, run Nmap, run this attack, do this. That would what I'd call your basic foundational pen testing, not particularly very effective and with very little ingenuity, but it's a good way of testing your control. So if you do that, now you don't have to employ a team to come in. You could run through all of your detections hourly if you wanted. You know, it's just a few servers in AWS, right? It's nothing for a large enterprise. But if that can prove on the hour or every night, once a week, whatever, all of my controls work. How do you know? They were all tested. They were all tested with simulated real attacks, not synthetic data, not test data. No, Nmap was run from Kali Linux on this host, attacking this Windows server. And 1 second later, we had an alert in the SOC with test predicated. So they knew it was a test, but that said Nmap is being run within the domain. Boom. You know, that is an incredible step forward for me in security operations, because there's always a horrible question that CISOs have, which is, okay, so we spent 10 million last year. Do they still work? Is it still working? And being able to go from an audit perspective, a compliance perspective, all of our controls are tested daily. Here's the report. And any that don't come back as green, tickets get automatically created in Jira or in GitLab or whatever. Issues are created, defects to go and fix them every night. You know, that is an incredibly powerful stance to take, and really cool with, things like Attack Range, I think, is produced and open source by Splunk. So possibly a good one to look at.
I've not actually looked at Attack Range. So we do a little bit of that on the master's pen test and stuff. So that's the kind of, you know, that's another thing that might be interesting to look at research in that area.
Definitely. And it's a really active project as well.
Yeah, so it's some interest. I mean, that's, the sort of automated pen test and stuff is an interesting area to look at.
There's two remaining questions, which I'll try and get through before I have to leave. Has the way Adarma considers graduates changed over the years? Yes, it has, definitely. So the only entryway into Adarma used to be as a SOC analyst. It's still a highly used and great way into the organization. Others, though, have definitely been, especially for entry level roles, you know, there are some people that have the capability to kind of step right into security engineering. I would say these tend to be, you know, obviously quite technically gifted people. They almost always have some form of scripting or programming experience. Don't need to be an expert, but they've got to have something there. And they tend to really get kind of technology. You know, they understand how things work together. They know what an API is, and perhaps they know how to, you know, simulate some stuff to test an API. know how to build their own infrastructure in AWS and perhaps have even automated a bit of it. So yeah, security analyst, security engineer tend to be entry-level roles, but I would definitely say, we expect quite a lot from a graduate coming in at a security engineer role. It's a tough role to get. It's, from my perspective, it's definitely harder than analyst because it is fundamentally at least a step up. But yeah, that's definitely a new route into the organization. We are considering introducing kind of a junior consultant, associate consultant, possibly for somebody with less technical acumen and more focused on problem solving and whiteboarding and an excellent communicator. We haven't done it yet, but we are considering it. Have we implemented infrastructure as code? In some areas for some projects, yes. Others, IT are less interested in doing so because the effort, bear in mind, Adarma has only got 300 employees. Our IT team is like less than 5. So there's automation can sometimes take you, 2 weeks to develop an automation for something that takes you 15 minutes once a year. That's a poor investment of time. You want to invest in infrastructure as code and automation orchestration, CI/CD, where it makes sense for what you're trying to achieve. And the final question is, what tools do we use in our CI/CD pipeline? So that's continuous integration, continuous deployment, or continuous delivery. We mostly use GitLab for a lot of it these days. So GitLab's really powerful, and you can deploy containers and Python and pipelines and all kinds of cool stuff in that. We've used Ansible in the past. I'm not sure how much we're using it anymore. Some custom Python code. What else? To be fair, actually, most of our stuff these days is in GitLab. It tends to be a bit of a one-stop shop. It's got some incredible features. Highly recommend you look into it, as it's also got a community-supported and community published version. I'm afraid that's me at time, so I need to run.
That's great, Harry. Thanks so much for coming in. Can we have a small round of applause?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Microphones.
Well, thank you all for engaging so much. It's great to present remotely and actually have people ask questions. It's really kind of off-putting when you're just kind of speaking to a blank screen. You never know if anyone's listening or cares. So really appreciate it. And thanks again, Rich and Bill, for having me. And
That's great. We'll catch up soon.
Indeed. Hope to see you all next year, hopefully, in person.
If you've got any questions, or you think of things after it's common, we can feed things to Harry and get some comment back.